833-288-3986.
What's stopping?
Why do I need to confess my sins to a priest?
What's stopping you? This is Called to Communion with Dr. David Anders on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
Hey everybody, welcome again to Call to Communion here on EWTN, a program unlike any other show, not only on this network, but on any network. A program specifically for non-Catholics Monday through Friday. How about that? If you've got a question about the Catholic faith, or if you'd just like to perhaps vent a little bit, tell us why you're not a Catholic and what is keeping you from becoming a Catholic, all that is fair game on this program, and we would love to hear from you. Here's our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. If you're listening to us outside of North America, please dial the number 1 and then 205-271-2985. You can also send us an email if you would rather do that. The address for that is ctc@ewtn.com. ctc@ewtn.com. Charles Beery is our producer. Matt Kabinski is our phone screener. Jeff Burson handles social media for us. If you want to ask a question via YouTube or Facebook, we are streaming there live right now. All you have to do is put your question in the comments box. Jeff will see it. He'll send it to us here in the studio, and off we go. I'm Tom Price, along with Dr. David
Tom,
Anders.
how are you today?
I'm doing very well. How are you?
I'm doing decent, thank you.
Interesting question here, and we've seen variations on this theme many times over these years. This is from Joan, who says, my brother, who was raised in a devoted Catholic family, went to Catholic school, served as an altar boy, married in the church, raised 6 children in the faith, then, toward the end of his life, left the church, married a divorced woman, and was buried at a Protestant church upon his death. I've not been able to figure out how this should be viewed as to his eternal salvation. I'm wondering if his final years of abandoning the church and all those years of being a faithful Catholic were of no benefit to his salvation. Thank you, Joan.
Yeah, thanks, Joan. I really appreciate the question. So to begin with, you said you haven't been able to figure out how all this pertains to his eternal salvation. Join the club, right? So figuring out whether or not people are saved is not our job. That's God's job. The final judgment is God's determination. What we do is try to help people, including ourselves, pursue the life of faith, hope, and charity and all the virtues, and to grow in virtue and the theological virtues in particular, persevering until we die. And then we leave the judgment of souls up to God. Now, we think the Catholic faith is the public means established by Christ, best suited to help people to do that. But we recognize that outside the Catholic Church, God can and does extend grace to people in extraordinary ways, meaning that we despair of the salvation of no man or woman. We can't ever look to any soul and point at them and say definitively, oh, that guy's going to hell. You know, it's not looking too good for Judas. but apart from that, I'd say we really can't ever finger anybody and say, I know that person is in hell. And we can say of some people, I know that person is in heaven. That would be the canonized saints. And for the rest of us, we can maintain an attitude of hopefulness because God desires that all be saved and come to the knowledge of the truth. So that's kind of the disposition that I try to bring to these kind of questions. Now, your more specific question about what about his life of Catholic practice, was that of no value if he defected from the faith? Well, I'm going to give you the plus side and the minus side on that. All right? St. Peter tells us in 2 Peter that when a person comes into the faith and to the life of virtue and then abandons it, that's a serious thing. That's a big problem. And he actually uses some dire language. He says, better not to have entered the way of righteousness than to enter it and fall away. But the falling away that Peter has in mind here specifically is a falling away into gross sin. And so while apostasy, that is abandoning the faith, is a sin in itself, I'm hesitant to saddle any individual with the charge, well, that guy is completely guilty of the sin of apostasy. Why do I say that? Because I've studied people leaving the faith. I've studied it a lot. I've read a lot of the sociology about it. I've read a lot of the theology about it. I know a lot of people in my personal experience. And most of the time when people walk away from the Catholic faith, in my opinion, most of the time, it's not because they say, well, I think the Catholic faith is just completely true, but I just want to abandon myself to hedonism and dissipation. That doesn't describe the mindset of most people who walk away. Some people, but not most people. Usually it's something like this. Well, I didn't really have a great relationship with God as a Catholic, or I didn't really understand the faith, or didn't really know how to make sense of the church and all of its traditions. And then I found this other church over here that had a kind of a simpler presentation of the religious path. It made more sense to me, and I got involved in a Bible study, and I married this woman, and off I went. In other words, I have a hard time forming the judgment that they did this with their eyes wide open, acting with impunity, right?
Yeah.
And so in that regard, would I say that your brother's lifetime of Catholic practice was of no avail? I would not say that, right? To begin with, perhaps, I don't know this, perhaps that in his life as a Catholic he had acquired habits of virtue that would have continued with him in life, right? And obviously he didn't have perhaps not a robust concept of the faith, or else he wouldn't have left, but maybe he had some habits of virtue that he carried over. Maybe he developed a kind of devotion and reverence for the name of Christ, so that when he unknowingly, let's charitably hope, ignorantly left the Catholic faith, he wasn't seeking to leave Christ in the process. He did to a certain extent, but maybe he wasn't aiming at that. And so I think there's a way to construe this that's hopeful with respect to your brother's salvation, that is charitable in judging his state of mind, and does find value in his life of Catholic faith up to that point, even though, while we recognize it's not objectively a good thing to leave the Catholic Church.
Well, sure. And I personally think that lost my train of thought here for a second. But the word that I want to get to is freeing, to not be in a judgmental mode and leaving it to God and being hopeful is very freeing, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah. I think that's the way to go. Well, there you go. And thank you so much for your email. And if you would like to send us an email for a future show, the address is ctc@ewtn.com. Well, we're doing great on the phones here. We've got 3 calls screened. 3 lines are open at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. In a moment, we'll be talking with Terry in Grand Rapids, Michigan, also Mary in Chicago, Martin in Muskegon, Michigan. Lots more straight ahead on this Thursday edition of Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders. Do stay with us.
The most original Catholic content is on EWTN Radio.
This is Doug Keck on this week's Mother Angelica Answering the Call. Mother explains what a mystic is. Our other topics include Jesus is indeed present in the Holy Eucharist, kneeling before the Eucharist, and blessed are those who endure.
Mother Angelica Answering the Call, Sunday afternoon, 2 Eastern, on EWTN Radio.
This is Life Issues with Brad Mattis, president of Life Issues Institute.
Here's a shout out to Lincoln Park High School in Brownsville, Texas. The school is designed to help pregnant and parenting girls get their diplomas. Cynthia Cardenas, the principal, said, "We hold their futures in our hands as educators. We have to do this the right way." Mothers have access to a free daycare center next door to the school. Some moms take their children to classes with them. The curriculum is like any other school in the district, but have concessions like excused absences for doctor appointments, car seats in the buses, and teachers with baby clothes for their students. One student didn't see a way forward until she came to Lincoln Park. Principal Cardenas said, "The students just need a little extra flexibility." God bless those making education possible for these mothers.
Like us on Facebook at Life Issues and stay informed, more informed than you've ever been.
It's Called to Communion here on EWTN. If you have a question for Dr. David Anders, we would love to hear from you at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Are you familiar with a wonderful little series that we have on the radio and on television? It's EWTN's Bookmark Brief. You know, each week Doug Keck interviews an author. He does the program, a great program, and then he'll also do what we call a bookmark brief, which could be anywhere from a minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, where the authorizer very quickly summarizes what the book is all about, why it would be of interest to readers. So you may want to check this out, EWTN's Bookmark Brief. It's also available on a subscription basis. Just go to EWTN.com, click on the word subscribe, and definitely keep listening to EWTN radio and television, because we bring you those bookmark briefs all day and every day, and I think they're a lot of fun. If you're ready now, let's go to the phones at 833-288-EWTN. Let's start with Terry. Terry is in Grand Rapids, Michigan, listening on the great Holy Family Radio. Hello, Terry. What's on your mind today?
Hi. Thank you so much for taking my call. I have a 14-and-a-half-year-old son who's going to be confirmed in May. He's asked me to be a sponsor, and I agreed. And in a moment of misguided brilliance, I gave him a composition book and said, you need to ask a lot of questions, and then I'll answer them. So far I've done so good thanks to your program, but he gave me one that I'm not sure as to how to answer. He asked, how and why should Christians engage in politics? Can you give me an answer for an eighth grader?
Exactly. So let me answer the why question first of all. Christians ought to engage in politics to help bring about a just state, justice in the polity. That's why we should do it.
Yeah.
Okay. How should we do it? The Christians should familiarize themselves with the church's social doctrine, so that you know what a just state consists in. And then, if you should either vote your conscience informed by the church's moral teaching, or if you want to get involved in the public sphere or public office, you should seek to bring about legislatively and in the executive and judicial branches judgments, rulings, and policies that would seek to bring the body politic into conformity with the church's moral vision. Now, I'm now going to that would be agreed on by any Catholic who answered this question, who knew the issues. I'm now going to get a little bit idiosyncratic here. No, I take that back. This is the Pope's vision as well. This was John Paul's vision as well. There is a temptation. It's a powerful temptation, not just to Catholics, but to everybody, to equate justice with an ideological prescription for the civil order. Right. So, what is ideology? I mean, ideology is a theory about the best policy prescriptions and how they might work almost magically, as it were, to bring about the desired social order. So, here are some ideologies you might be familiar with. Capitalism is an ideology. It's the idea that if you do X, Y will necessarily follow. If you free up markets and free ownership of property and things like that, get the government out of the way, then it will necessarily, the rising tide will necessarily lift all boats, and society would be better accordingly. And so we should just automatically and always and everywhere pursue free trade and reduction of government interference. That'd be capitalist ideology. Communist ideology would be another ideology that says, the biggest problem in civil society is the inequity in economies and the haves and the have-nots. And just the right way to deal with that is for the state to own everything and to give to each one according to his needs and to require from each one according to his abilities. You just put that benevolent tyranny into place and everybody will be happy. So each of those is an ideological vision. And the church says, Pope John Paul in particular, in some of his encyclicals, says, look, Catholic moral theology and Catholic social doctrine is not ideological. We don't have a theory of social organization that works in a kind of almost mechanical or magical way. If you follow this one principle always, everywhere, and to everyone, then magically happiness will come out the other end. That we don't approach it that way. We always recognize that even the best moral principles have to be implemented in real time prudently, given the exigencies of the particular culture in which you live. So let me give you an example. When the Spaniards, and look, the Spaniards did a lot of things wrong in Central America, okay? But when the Spaniards colonized Central America, they recognized that the Aztecs were engaged in human sacrifice, and on a pretty wide scale. And they could have said, you know what? Human sacrifice is always and everywhere horrible and wrong, which it is. And therefore, if we just pass a law outlawing human sacrifice and punish it whenever we find it, then we'll just bring about a just state. It'll just naturally result in the end of human sacrifice, and everyone will be Catholic, and it'll be wonderful. It didn't work that way. And the British found the same thing when they colonized India.
Yeah.
And they said, the Indians have the practice of sati, or they did at that time, which is wife burning on the funeral pyres of their husbands, and that's terrible, and we should eliminate wife burning. And what the Spaniards and the English found was, when they simply prescribed that those immoral behaviors, they got more of them because they provoked a kind of nativist reaction to the imperial overlords, and the idea was, oh yeah, you European powers, you're going to tell us what to do? You watch us engage in human sacrifice and wife burning, right? And so a prudent policy is one that says, okay, what can we realistically accomplish? Right? That's not what ideology does. Ideology says, I've got the one-size-fits-all solution. I'm going to buy that program, and I'm going to ruthlessly enforce it. But prudent statesmanship says, I know what moral principles we should be living by. I also know what the actual situation on the ground is and what I have to work with. And so I will do some give and take, and I will make prudent decisions to advance the moral good as much as I am able. And that's the way I think a Catholic has to operate. You learn the Church's moral teaching, seek to bring it about in civil society, but don't get swept up into the illusion, into the allure of ideology.
Terry, is that helpful for you?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I'm going to listen to the podcast later on.
That's why we put it out there. Sure. Terry, thank you so much for your call. That opens up a line for you right now at 833-288-EWTN. One line open, 833-288-3986. Going now to Martin in Muskegon, Michigan, listening on Sirius XM, Channel 130. Martin, what's on your mind today, sir?
Thank you for taking my call. I have, as I read through the Bible and talk with my Christian friends, come across words that seem to be used interchangeably, but I believe are distinct. Perhaps Doc Anders could clarify that. One is redeemed, one is saved, and one is sanctified.
Yeah,
Okay.
sure. I can handle that. Thank you so much. So, redemption is a word drawn from, it's a metaphor drawn from the world of human bondage, of slavery. And to redeem someone is to buy them back from captivity or from slavery. Salvation is a word drawn from a different human domain. Really, it would be more the domain of warfare, when a conquering army saves some polity, some town, village, or region from an impending disaster because some foreign invading power is moving in. So the good guys in the battle come in, sweep in, save the day, kick out the bad guys.
Okay.
Right? Obviously, redemption and salvation are similar concepts, but they're drawn from different domains of human experience. Now, in the spiritual life, both of these words are used as metaphors. And that's, I think, is incredibly important. They're just metaphors to help us get at what Christ does for us. So sometimes people talk about Christ redeeming us from slavery to sin, for example, because many people experience their life in sin as a kind of slavery, a kind of bondage to my own disordered passions. Well, obviously, we're not talking about handing a ransom payment to a foreign agent, although some of the fathers thought that even that was taking place. One of the earliest views of the doctrine of the atonement was that Christ, by his death, was making payment to Satan to liberate people. Now, that's typically, most Catholic theologians today wouldn't take that literalistic a view of the redemption. They'd see that as a kind of metaphor, not a literal truth, although some of the ancients did actually see it that way. If you want to actually find a wonderful modern fiction narrative that depicts salvation as redemption, look to The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis, which has exactly that picture of what Christ accomplishes for us, namely paying off the devil, right? Even though I don't think that's literally the case. Sometimes the language of salvation is used. Again, we are besieged, as it were, by the life of sin and the devil, death, and hell. And Christ comes in and defeats these conquering powers, these alien forces, and liberates us. Sanctification is yet another term described to what Christ accomplishes for us, and it simply means to make people holy, to grow in holiness, which is nothing other than growth in the love of God. Now, these three concepts are allied. They're all metaphors to describe the one underlying reality of what happens to the soul in relationship to Christ.
Okay, and there you go. Thank you so much for your question today, Martin. It's Call to Communion here on EWTN. Couple of lines open at the moment, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Let's go to Mary now, a first-time caller from Detroit, listening online, EWTN.com. Hey, Mary, what's on your mind today?
Hi. First, I'd like to say if Dr. Anders could write a book with all of his Q&As, I think that would be a wonderful read, and it would really help.
I'd buy it.
My question right now is, so we have 3 young adult children. Our youngest is 20, is in college. His roommates are Catholic. They believe, they don't practice. He's within a thriving Catholic community. Well, when we came home this over Christmas, we went to Mass, and he said, church is useless, the homily was terrible, blah, blah, blah. And so then it led to a discussion. He's struggling. He believes in God, isn't quite sure that Jesus is God, has friends at school who have no faith whatsoever. But he brought up to me, how do we know the Bible is real? There's a lot of terrible stuff in the Bible, especially the Old Testament. How do we know it's real? How do we know that Jesus existed? How do we know that Jesus is God? And this is a kid who became a Eucharistic minister on his own and didn't want us to find out about it. So he had the faith before, and I know he's going, and I told him, I said, I don't have all the answers. And so I started with, do you believe Socrates existed and Aristotle? And he said yes. And I said,
Mary, I'm going to jump. Yeah, and I am going to jump in because we're coming up on a hard break. David, you want to jump in on that?
I do, but I may want to take this call over the break as well because this is such an important topic.
Okay.
But let me get started. So first of all, your description of your son says to me that he is both eager and sincere. The way he sought out being an altar server or Eucharistic minister, even in secret, not wanting you to know. And now the way he's asking these questions in earnest, and it sounds to me in a certain measure of distress, a kind of existential angst there, tells me that he's eager and sincere about his spiritual life, and that's a fantastic thing.
Yeah.
And the questions that he's asking are the appropriate questions to ask for his state of life. He's moving from an engagement with the faith that is more childlike and literalistic to one that is going to require significantly more nuance. And because he has not yet encountered people of faith who have that more nuanced and broader understanding of their relationship to Scripture and the tradition, he doesn't know where to turn. So he feels confused, he feels threatened, but that's only because he doesn't have a broad enough perspective, and that's what we're going to try to give him, right? So, first of all, I like the answer that you gave him when he asked about the existence of Christ, and you pointed him to the historical personages of Socrates and Aristotle, and I think that's a good place to begin, and there's vastly more evidence for the existence of Jesus than there is for the existence of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, although no one doubts their existence. The textual and cultural witness to the person of Jesus of Nazareth is just really overwhelming, and even the most antagonistic textbook ever published is rarely going to deny the existence of Jesus as an historical individual. But that's not the only reason I like the question, right? The other reason I like the question is that we know of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. We care about these guys, not because they were divine saviors, but because they were brilliant thinkers who gave human beings insight into what it means to be a human being and to live a good life and to think about reality and the moral life and transcendence. And their ideas have perennial value, right? And so that's an aspect of the Christian faith that we also have to engage, namely the Catholic Church as a wisdom tradition. And I want to come back to that after the break.
So sit tight, Mary. We'll continue this on the other side of the break. We'll also talk with Eric in Waco, Texas. A couple of lines open for you right now at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Call to communion on this Thursday afternoon on EWTN.
The most original and exclusive Catholic content is on EWTN Radio.
I don't like looking back. I prefer to look forward and keep moving forward. There's plenty to cover. I do a lot of research and try to dig out the bits and pieces of a life or of an agenda that people don't want to talk about.
The World Over with Raymond Arroyo. Tonight, 8 Eastern on EWTN Radio and Television.
This is Dr. David Anders. If you missed part of today's show, catch the encore tonight at 11 Eastern or anytime at EWTN Podcast Central. Visit us at EWTN.com/radio/podcasts.
Hi, I'm Greg Willits from RosaryArmy.com.
And I'm Jennifer Willits, his wife.
Have you ever heard the phrase, sitting at the School of Mary?
There are many different ideas of what this means. Pope Benedict XVI said, the Rosary is a school of Mary in which Christians can learn to let the lamp of faith shine brighter in their hearts.
And Pope St. John Paul II wrote that with the Rosary, the Christian people sits at the School of Mary and is led to contemplate the beauty on the face of Christ.
Through the Rosary, the faithful receive abundant grace, as though from the very hands of the Mother of the Redeemer.
When we faithfully pray the Rosary each day, we're given an opportunity to see Jesus through the eyes of his mother and ours, Mary, the one person who knew him best.
Visit our website at rosaryarmy.com.
And you can listen to our shows, Adventures in Imperfect Living, Catechism Class, and more at rosaryarmy.com and wherever you find your favorite podcasts.
Hi, this is Cy Kellett. Later today on Catholic Answers Live, 2 hours of open forum. Jimmy Aiken, our guest. Catholic Answers Live, 6 p.m. Eastern on EWTN Radio. Now, back to Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders.
Hey, what's stopping you from becoming a Catholic? Let's talk about that here on EWTN's Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders. And our phone number is 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Before the break, we were talking with Mary in Detroit about her son, who seems to be kind of on the cusp of losing his faith, asking about how do we know Jesus is a real person. He also mentioned that he was very hurt by the scandal with priests.
Yes, and the text of the Bible posed some difficulties for him, as well as the apparent uselessness of Mass and the utter irrelevance of the recent homily that he engaged. So we're going to talk about all those things.
Okay.
So before the break, I was really talking about the kinds of questions he's asking are the right kinds of questions at his age, and he's so far approached the faith. It sounds to me, looking at, say, the text of the Bible as a sort of literal historical narrative of factual truths about God and the moral life, to be believed or disbelieved based on the preponderance of evidence, and that's kind of where he's left it, right? What I want to shift from that for a minute, because Mary also mentioned the existence of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, and I want to look at an aspect of the faith that perhaps your son hasn't considered, and that is approaching the Catholic faith as a wisdom tradition. What do I mean by that? Well, throughout world history, we see a lot of these ancient cultures, great cultures, whether in Hebraic culture, Hellenistic culture, Indian or Chinese civilizations, that have developed literary, religious, philosophical traditions aimed at helping people to live good lives, to understand the truth about reality and the moral life with practical wisdom for daily living, as well as a sort of broad theoretical account of the meaning of human existence. That's really what I mean by a wisdom tradition. And what came out of Plato and Aristotle would be emblematic of that. And we're often accustomed to thinking of the Catholic faith, the particulars of the Catholic faith, as just true or false in the abstract, the way, say maybe a chemical formula is true or false, or a scientific theory is true or false, without really considering, well, what are the ramifications of the truth or falsehood of this way of looking at reality? Does it translate into wisdom for living, into human flourishing? And that's where I think your son is really not considering at all. What are the implications of Christianity being true or false? And not just true or false, but livable or not as a community of faith and as a wisdom tradition. And I would contend that if you approach the faith from that angle, the evidence of its truth and utility are everywhere present. So let's examine some of them, right? The Catholic faith proposes as a truth this very elevated idea that human beings are created with dignity because they exist in the likeness and image of God, right? Now, you can approach that and ask questions like, well, did God really create Adam and Eve, right? Because that's where we learn about the image and likeness of God. And that would be looking at it as a bare proposition. But now let's look at it as an illuminating idea, which is the way the Catechism looks at it, that has the capacity to enlighten our lives and our relationship to one another. So if I try that on like a pair of glasses and see the world through the lens of human dignity, well, what do I get? What do I get from my pains? Well, I get the institutions of benevolence that grew up in the Christian world over 2,000 years. Hospitals, free education.
Yeah.
I get the regime of human rights, the idea that the poor have dignity and should be cared for, that, say, slavery is wrong, that misogyny is wrong, that people shouldn't be compelled to marry against their will or reduced to prostitution or chattel slavery or something like that, that criminals have rights, that jurors have rights to their consciences and should not be required to pass judgment when the evidence is not compelling beyond a reasonable doubt. These are things that I imagine your son takes for granted as constituents of a good and just and livable society, and yet they can't be taken for granted because they have not always existed. And they are the fruit of Christian civilization. Non-Christian civilization has typically not embraced these ideas or these institutions. So you can look at the image of God doctrine as an abstract truth or falsehood. You can also look at it as a kind of symbol, if you will, that illumines our experience and creates a wise and just society. Right? Let's take the idea that God has made himself known to us through the divine reason and our own acts of intellection, right? That's the teaching of the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Logos, the Word, the reasonable principle of God. And he made all things, and all things have their being in him. And that it is precisely our participation in the divine reason that makes us to be in God's likeness and image. Well, you try that idea on, and now things like philosophy and science and empirical investigation and questioning and research, again, goods that we just take for granted in the modern world, but cannot be taken for granted because they have not always been the case, but they are so powerfully illuminating and transformative. Those ideas come from someplace. If you like things like philosophy and reasoning and evidence and the scientific revolution, you owe those things to the wisdom of the Catholic tradition. Stanley Yockey, the Benedictine scientist and philosopher, who's written so much on the origins of Western science and its debt to the Catholic Church, is a great place to go for that. And so I'm not going to belabor the point. Tom Woods' book, How the Catholic Church Built Western Civilization, is another good place to go.
Yes.
But as your son goes through his life and maybe begins to count up all of the cultural norms and values and institutions and goals that he appreciates, that he takes for granted, maybe in light of which he critiques the Catholic faith and says, where did these good things come from? I guarantee you that he will find that they are the fruit of Christian civilization, all right? That's another way of looking at the question of Catholicism's truthfulness, right? And when you get to the question of, say, the literal truths of the Old Testament, or the literal claims of the Old Testament, should I take them seriously at face value? What you find is that the Catholic Church has always had a far more nuanced understanding of that. And the Fathers of the Church, for example, did not think the narratives of the Old Testament should be understood merely as literal truths, but precisely as moral and allegorical messages about the transcendent destiny of the human soul. And so each of these objections that your son has raised belies his ignorance of this much deeper and larger context of Catholic intellectual history. And, he's interested, as he should be, in the knowledge of, the propositional knowledge of God. Can I say of God or Jesus, does he exist or not? And that's good, and we can get to that. But there's also the participatory knowledge of God, knowing God by doing rather than by thinking, right?
Yeah.
Do I know God insofar as my life and behavior have been conformed to God's way of being? I mean, it's the difference between knowing, how to read a music score. Hey, well, that's an A sharp right there, right? And actually being able to play the piece, you see. And that's the real transformative knowledge of God, when it has entered into the fabric of my soul and transformed my consciousness. So, yes, I'm concerned with Jesus as an historical person, but look, believing that Jesus was an historical person doesn't necessarily transform my life. I mean, the devil believes that Jesus was an historical person. Coming to view the world as Jesus viewed it, seeing the world through Christ's eyes. That's how Pope Benedict describes the act of faith. It's not just gazing at Jesus as an object from afar. It's actually coming to participate in Christ's way of seeing. That's the knowledge of Christ that is transformative and salvific, right? And so you don't neglect, we're not ignoring the one, but we can't neglect the other. Now, when you begin to approach the faith in this way, you begin to find reasons for belief that transcend the merely literalistic approach to the Bible that is hanging him up. Now, I'd like to give you a resource for him to consider, and I'd love for him to engage this resource and then call me and talk to me about it, all right? I gave myself actually a series of lectures last year in the Diocese of Birmingham entitled The Catholic Wisdom Tradition, or The Catholic Faith as a Wisdom Tradition. And they are available at the Birmingham Diocese Evangelization and Faith Formation webpage. If you go to YouTube, actually, and you look up Birmingham Diocese Evangelization and Faith Formation, Catholic Faith as a Wisdom Tradition, I think I gave about 6 lectures on various aspects of the faith, approaching it in this way. I'd really encourage him to go take a peek at those, and then maybe call me back. Another one would be the book Introduction to Christianity by Joseph Ratzinger, who would become Pope Benedict. Ratzinger wrote this book in the late 60s to people who were suffering a great deal more skepticism than your son.
Yeah.
And the purpose of the text was, can I take, say, modern science, biology, historical criticism, these challenges of modernity seriously, and yet still find a reason to profess the faith? And Introduction to Christianity is Ratzinger's answer to that question. Another one would be Joseph Ratzinger's lecture that he gave at the Sorbonne called On the Truth of Christianity. So those are all places to start.
What a great call. And Mary, thank you so much. I know we went a little bit long on this, but it was very important to give you all that information for your son. God bless you, Mary. Thanks for your concern and for your call. It's Called to Communion here on EWTN. A quick shout out here to another longtime member of our EWTN radio family, Sacred Heart Radio, Catholic radio for the Northwest, is celebrating their 22nd year with us this week. They began with one station. I remember it very well, KBLE in Seattle. They now cover Washington State and Alaska with 12 AM and FM stations. How about that? Congratulations to Ron Belter and his great team at Sacred Heart Radio from all your friends here at EWTN. One more quick thing, and then we'll get back to the phones. Be sure to join us, and this is very important, for the 2023 March for Life. It is tomorrow at 9:30 a.m. Eastern here on EWTN television and radio. I might point out this is the very first March for Life post Roe versus Wade. There's a lot on the line here. The fight is not over. The struggle continues, albeit a little bit different. So do check it out tomorrow at 9:30 a.m. Eastern, the March for Life, right here and only here on EWTN. All right, back to the phones now for Eric in Waco, Texas, listening on the great Red Sea Radio. Hey, Eric, what's on your mind today, sir?
Hi, good afternoon. Good to be with you. I have a question that was raised by a very good Protestant friend of mine, devout person. And the question is, do the Lord's instructions to pray the Lord's Prayer exclude prayers to the saints?
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. So here is the question that I would put back to your Protestant friend. Does the Lord's instructions about the Lord's Prayer preclude his asking his friends to pray for him? Now, I have yet to meet a Protestant who thinks that it is wrong to pray for his friends. I have yet to meet one. I have yet to meet a Protestant who thinks it is wrong to ask his friends for prayer.
Yeah.
Well, that's the answer to the question. It is not wrong to pray for your friends, and it is not wrong to ask your friends to pray for you, and those things do not conflict with the teaching of the Lord's Prayer. Catholic devotion to the saints is nothing other than asking our friends to pray for us. Yeah. That is exactly how we conceptualize it, and that is the reality of the thing. It is not the worship of saints. It is not to claim that the saint possesses some intrinsic power or authority, that in his own name or her own name he can grant favors as if he were a god or something. We don't believe that. The intercession of the saints is nothing other than the saints praying for us, just like you would pray for your friends.
All right. Is that helpful for you, Eric?
That is. Thank you.
All right. Thanks so much for your call. Quick question here from Patrick via YouTube in Coral Springs, Florida, who says, I would like to get a Catholic Bible with large print. Is there one you would recommend?
Right. So I usually recommend that people get a hold of the New Revised Standard Version Catholic Edition. I presume you can get a large print edition of that.
I think so. Very good. And here's Richard now, a first-time caller from Central New Jersey, listening on the great Domestic Church Media. Hello, Richard. What's on your mind today, sir?
Hello. Good afternoon, and thank you for taking my call.
Sure.
Well, next week, I'm going into the hospital to undergo surgery, and I'll be going in a state of grace. And I have an advance directive that says do not resuscitate. And I was wondering how the church views that. Does the church, for example, view that as me taking my own life by not allowing attempts to jumpstart my heart, for example? Or does it view it perhaps like I'm committing suicide? So that's my question. How does the church view the advance directives?
Thanks. I appreciate the question. So we are not obligated to do everything possible to prolong a life, but we are not permitted to seek to end a life by withholding the necessities of life, like food or water, if such things can be metabolized. Now, there does come a point in a person's life when they can no longer metabolize food and water, and therefore it's useless to administer them. But you can't deliberately starve someone to death. You can't deliberately cause them to die of dehydration. And if there is some reasonable intervention that can be made, and the prospect of success is reasonable, and the burden of the treatment is not vastly disproportionate to the promised benefit, then we have an obligation to preserve life. Now, there are medical interventions that we do not have to pursue. Let me give you an example. Let us say, for example, that you live in a third world country without access to decent medical care, and you have a condition, and there is a treatment for the condition, but for you to acquire the treatment, you would have to pay, say, 10 times your family's annual income, and you don't have insurance, and there's no way to do it, and it might extend your life by 6 months. Well, that would just, this is an extreme example, that would just be an intolerable burden without a lot of benefit. And the church says you don't have to seek out that condition. You don't have to do that, right? Here's one. Let's say you have a pacemaker, and you're in late stage Lou Gehrig's disease, which is exactly the situation that my father was in.
Yeah.
And periodically those pacemakers, their batteries run out, and you got to replace them.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Doctor says, Anders, you might have another year, and we're not sure when this battery's going to give out. It might give out in a year, it might give out in 6 months. Do I need to go under the knife, have them cut my chest open, go in there, replace the battery on my pacemaker? No, I don't have to do that. Right? What if Anders is at the end of his life, and he says, I hadn't got but a year or two left. This Lou Gehrig's is bad stuff. I don't think I want to live to see the end of this. I'm going to ask Doc to turn off my pacemaker. Can I do that? No.
Quite a difference.
No. There's all the difference in the world between not replacing the pacemaker, that's refraining from some medical action that's not likely to do much and would be burdensome, and then making a decision to do something specifically to shorten my life. They're very different intentions, and therefore they're different moral acts. Now, I don't know what your particular medical situation is, right? But I'm having a hard time seeing how restarting one's heart, that's not costly. If one is unconscious, it's not painful. It's not generally not burdensome. Maybe there's some situation in winter it is. I don't know all the medical details. But I don't think that's going to fall under the same kind of condition as, say, not replacing the battery in the pacemaker, right? That is a reasonable, low-cost, high success rate, very little burden intervention that can reasonably extend life, right? So I would not advise you to go in with that order in place. Now, there are situations where you can step back and say, I don't want that medical treatment. I don't think this is one of them.
Richard, thank you so much for your call. We'll be praying for a successful outcome for that surgery tomorrow. Thanks again for your call. YouTube, Tony is watching on YouTube today. Tony says, what first made Dr. Anders doubt the concept of imputed righteousness in his reading of Paul? I ask specifically about what he read in Paul because Protestants I talk to will immediately dismiss the fathers.
Yeah, thanks. So I will say a word about the fathers. I first began to have doubts about imputation when I read St. Augustine of Hippo, simply because Augustine was the father that all the Protestants quoted. And when I read Augustine, I realized he didn't believe in any imputation, and that was a big problem for me. So then I started digging around in Protestant biblical scholarship, especially the new perspectives on Paul, writers like N.T. Wright and Christopher Stendhal and James Dunn and E.P. Sanders. And, there's some other modern characters in the same vein like Pamela Eisenbaum and Paula Fredrickson, two Jewish New Testament scholars, that all had come to the conclusion that Luther radically misread Paul, right? And so that was pretty uncomfortable too. And the basic contention was that Paul in the book of Romans and the book of Galatians meant exactly what he said. That he said what he meant, and he meant what he said.
Mm-hmm.
And what Paul actually said was, look, I'm interested in the question of Jews and Gentiles and whether Gentiles have to follow the law of Moses. And that's exactly what he meant, right? And what Luther did is he took those as types of sort of a much more abstract question, which was how does the soul in abstraction come into right relationship with God, right? And he saw Jew and Gentile as a kind of metaphor that was universally applicable to, say, the condition of 15th century Catholic monastics and their moral striving, when in fact Paul did not have 15th century Catholicism in view when he wrote Romans and Galatians, but did have the very specific question of Jew-Gentile relationships in view, and his categorical response was that Gentiles don't have to follow the law of Moses. And so justification by faith in this context refers to exactly what Paul said it referred to, namely, you can be accepted as a member of God's covenant family by faith in Christ without respect to the moral law. But to the question of the, no, it's not the moral law, the Mosaic law, but with respect to the underlying question of the morality of the Christian, Paul was equally emphatic. It is not those who hear the law, it is those who obey the law who will be declared righteous, Romans 2:13. Paul tells us emphatically that the verdict, well done, good and faithful servant, is granted not on the basis of faith alone, but on the basis of the transformation of the moral life in Christ. And so Paul teaches the Catholic doctrine of justification. I mean, that is evident on the face of it and was the consensus of the fathers. Now, interesting, Matthew J. Thomas wrote recently a doctoral dissertation that's been published on Paul's works of the law in the writings of the 2nd century Catholic theologians, 2nd century Christian theologians. And to a man, they all understand works of the law to refer to the Jewish ceremonial precepts that separate Jew from Gentile. So there's really perfect consistency between the teaching of Paul and the teaching of the earliest Christian theologians from the 2nd century on. And it's not until the 4th century that you begin to see a shift in the interpretation of Paul in the understanding of justification in this kind of sort of broader abstract category, right? So the historical scholarship, the biblical scholarship, the language of St. Paul himself, I mean, it was all sort of converging on a point, which was that Luther got the thing dead wrong. And then Protestant scholars like Alistair McGrath and his 2-volume History of Justification, Justitia Dei, who concluded that, this is a Protestant talking here, that Luther's doctrine was a complete theological novelty. Now, add to that, like the underlying spiritual truth that Lutheranism, taken quite literally, is the cultural training in narcissism, because it teaches the soul that what I need is completely unmerited, a positive regard, right? That ultimately the soul is saved by its own private relationship with an utterly gratuitous benevolence that is completely unmerited. I mean, that's just the description of a narcissist.
Yeah.
And there's some, I believe personally, strongly, that Luther himself was a psychologically unbalanced soul who simply theologized his own neurosis and then made it normative for all of Christendom and did a great deal of harm to the moral life of very many.
Wow. Tony, thanks so much for your question via YouTube. We got a great question from Billy in the Midwest regarding distributism. Don't have time to do that because the music is coming up, so we're going to tackle that one on Monday's program.
Great.
Tomorrow we won't have a program because we will be carrying our live coverage from the March for Life in D.C., so we're looking forward to our next visit, which is going to be on Monday.
Well, how about that?
How about that? Dr. David Anders, have a wonderful weekend.
Thanks, Tom.
We do this program normally Monday through Friday at 2 p.m. Eastern with an encore at 11 p.m. Eastern. And then you can always check out the podcast. Some great questions came up today. You may want to do a little refresher on those by going to EWTNradio.net and clicking on the word podcast. On behalf of our fantastic team, I'm Tom Price along with Dr. David Anders. We will see you Monday at this same time. Have a great weekend, and we will see you then. Be sure to tune in for the March for Life coverage from D.C. tomorrow. God bless.
The most original and exclusive Catholic